The first time I saw a miniature painted by Kirill, I was fascinated with the art of painting highly reflective non-metallic metal in miniatures. And while I can't promise that your miniature is going to look like this by the end of today's video, I can promise you to teach you some of the core principles and foundational understandings that lie behind being able to create such works. So in this video, we'll be painting the Mandalorian bust, and we're going to be diving into understanding reflections and how non-metallic metal works. We'll address some of the concerns and issues that you might have when trying to paint in this style, and we're going to be playing around with different textures and how to use different brush strokes in your painting. But before we can start painting, we need to have a solid grasp of the theory of why non-metallic metal behaves the way it does. So let's have a look at the theory. When we're painting highly reflective materials, we have to think of them sort of like a mirror. This means that the light is going to behave a little bit like this. The angle that the light comes from is going to be the same angle as the light bounces off. We all know that if we're looking at ourselves in the mirror and we're maintaining eye contact and then we step to the side of the mirror, we're then going to be able to see at the same angle in the reflection on the mirror. We can illustrate this by looking at a funny mirror, a picture like this. Here we can see various parts of the body being changed and distorted by the angle of the mirror. Since the mirror has this sort of curve, this means that the reflections are gonna have a similar curve. And while we no doubt unconsciously understand that these highly reflective surfaces are gonna reflect parts of the environment, it's important to have a conscious understanding of how and why these things work if we're trying to paint them on miniatures. Whenever we're painting the material, we really have to think about how soft or hard the material is. The harder the material, the more reflective it's going to be. This has to do with the molecular structure of the material and how light is going to bounce off. So mirrors and highly polished steel is really going to have very hard surface where the light is going to very clearly reflect. So following along with the equation we've seen just before, we understand that the surface of the object that's casting the reflection is also going to be determining for how the reflection looks. Take a look at these spheres. Here we can notice how reflections in the center of the sphere really don't seem to distort that much, but as we move to the sides and upwards, we're going to see how buildings and trees that we know are tall, straight structures are going to have a curve in the reflection. This is because the image that we're seeing of the sphere has a curve on the surface. So in the same way that we were seeing in the funny mirror, we're here seeing the sphere distort the reflections in a way where the reflections are being bent to match the shape of the reflected surface. Being able to paint these reflections comes down to a foundational grasp on understanding how different shapes can be brought into some very simple surfaces and then painting the reflections to match these simple surfaces. Some foundational shapes could be a sphere, a pyramid, and a cylinder. The helm of the Mandalorian, for instance, consists of half of a sphere and sitting atop a cylinder. You might have heard that the history of non-metallic metal dates back to canvas painters who were painting in reflections before they had paints available that actually had metallic pigments in them. And in this history also lies part of a controversy that exists with non-metallic metal in miniature painting. It's really a technique that's focused on working in 2 dimensions. When we're picking up the miniature and have the freedom to be able to look at it in 360 degrees, there really is no way for us to paint the reflections in a way that will follow the curvature of the shapes wherever we look at the miniature from. This means that oftentimes when we're painting non-metallic metal, we're prioritizing a single view, or we always have to make a compromise between the different angles of viewing the miniature. And this leads to a form of painting that some people might consider to be painting for pictures rather than painting for real life. I think there's a perfectly fine compromise between these two positions in the debate, and I think painting highly reflective non-metallic metal is a very creative endeavor to follow. The reason for this is that we get to depict the environment that the character is standing in on the figure itself. So I think there's an added element of storytelling when trying to do this type of non-metallic metal, and I think that it's well worth as painters that we learn this skill. In this first step, I am starting with underpainting, and here I'm really just trying to establish some different chromatic interest in the shadow. So for the chest area, you can see I've used a greenish brown, and here I'm coming in with red tones and different blue tones as well. You can especially see on the back how one side is red and one side is leaning towards more blue. This is just some of the inspiration that I took from a reference, and I'm really just trying to create something that is going to provide some chromatic shift and some interest in the darker pieces of the figure. Once the underpainting is done, which is fairly quick, we can go in and start to sketch in the non-metallic metal. We can pick out some of the recesses and kind of base coat the larger planes with just this turquoise grayish tone. I can also start to place some of the lights with my midtone. This can catch some of the edges as well, and you can see the paint is a little thin here, and once I start building up brighter layers, we're really working with thicker, more covering paint, such as what we're seeing here. It's just a variety of grays that have different additions, mostly colder colors such as green and blue here. Here I'm picking out some of the shadows and trying to separate different elements. You can notice kind of the loose textural feel of the brushstroke as I follow the edges and paint in the shapes of the brightest highlights. We're working with thick paint and having very free, loose brushstrokes. I'm picking out some of the edge highlights in the bottom here, remembering the edges play a big role in conveying the non-metallic metal look. For this kind of eye visor here, we're seeing some darker colors. This should be black. So you can see the shoulder pad is left at roughly about 3 different colors, and if the feeling of non-metallic metal doesn't work when we put down 3 different values, well then it's because we've won't have an effect that works. So this like very rough sketch is important to master when we're painting in this way. It should work with only 3 colors. We should already have the feeling of reflection there. So it's very important to keep in mind this very simple approach and these very simple steps in order to create a painting that works effectively. No amount of blending is going to save us if the light placement isn't correct. So here we're putting down again the 3 same values and trying to find a horizon line and a point where the lights would kind of spread from the top of the figure down to the bottom of the helmet. And we can pick out the edges once again to kind of sharpen the look of the helmet a little bit. Trying not to base coat the shading that we've done with the airbrush, since having that lighter color up on top is going to help us get coverage with the brighter colors there quickly. And so we should also have a bright reflection on the black kind of eye part in the middle there. So I'm drawing in lines that kind of go into the front of the helmet as well, and with the darker colors here I'm just trying to block in some feelings of the reflections. The trees and the buildings that curve up towards the top of the helmet. Here I'm trying to keep that same thing in mind and trying to find kind of the line of the horizon and paint in some reflections. So we can have darker shapes that kind of cut into the section of the light that separates the sky from the buildings or the environment that is around the figure. And on the other side we can work with some different colors and using more additions of yellow here. The 2 sides shouldn't be completely different. They're still in the same environment, but they can certainly have different additions of colors as long as we're building some sort of bridge between the 2. And I also use a little bit of red on the far side there. I'm coming in with a color that has stronger additions of white here for the final highlighting. And just carving out some round shape here. Making sure that we have that round highlight that really conveys the spherical shape of the helmet. You can pick out some edges with the more yellowish tone on the opposite side and have some feeling of the light also crawling down the side of that face. And we can have more specular highlights as the shadow shapes are present in the reflection on the top of the helmet. They can also cover the edges as well. I find that using a bigger brush like the one I'm using here really helps to bolden my brush strokes and just kind of put the stroke down with more convincingly. So sometimes having these used brushes can actually help in the painting process, I find, because you're not as careful as you are when you have the sharper tip. It's very dark here, but I'm just putting in some shadow shapes in the back. It'll be more visible in a little bit. And again, trying to find the roundness of the highlight on the top. Doing roughly the same on the shoulder pad and blocking in the mid-tone in the back. Here we can also find the horizon line And thinking back to the references and trying to have the shape of the light change once we go down the cylinder of the back of the helmet. Now the shape changes from round to more cylindrical, and the light has to reflect that shift. We're coming in with some glazing of mid-tone in order to soften the horizon line a little bit. Picking out some edges and just building stronger lights. Okay, so once I feel confident that the sketch for the non-metallic metal is blocked in, which I think that it is about now, I'll move on to painting the red armor. The red we're using here is really maybe a little bit too saturated, but you'll see when I build up the lighting that it'll desaturate a little bit once we add more brightness and we can cool it down. Again, it's especially important to keep working with the larger volumes and not get lost in the weathering or the micro volumes of scratches and dents that are in the armor. Highlighting and shading these is something that'll come later on in the process. And there's this weird kind of section that sits a little bit into the chest that should also catch some light at the bottom of the edges there. And we can do the same for his clothing, which is underneath the armor. I try to cover some of the underpainting with this sort of brown mid-tone. And here the effects of the underpainting should really show that once we cover the same brown mid-tone, it's going to react differently to the different layers that we've put down underneath. And getting some basic volumetric lighting in on the cloak as well. We can notice kind of the certainty of the brush stroke and the tapering lines that we're painting everything with when we're doing this sort of layering line work that we're painting here. Here we're glazing in some of the blue of the sky, trying to add just a little bit more color to the non-metallic metal once we have more of the lighting in place on the rest of the figure as well. And here I think we're glazing in some of the warmer orange tone. And again, very much looking at the reference with the temperature contrast and the shapes of the reflections as well. Here we can use some of the redder tones to kind of bridge the gap between the two in terms of value, meaning that the yellowish highlight is stronger and the reddish mid-tone reflections are not as strong. And we can paint in some color into the shapes that sit on the horizon, so we can use some different greens and browns to kind of show some of the colors of the environment here. The closeness or the proximity to the figure is really important in this matter, since buildings or things that are closer should have higher contrast and have like stronger lights overall, whereas things that are farther away should be more abstract and be softer shapes. And using this kind of warm sand color to paint in some of the environmental reflections. When we're using this glaze consistency, we can get some nice variations when we are using it over the darker tones and the mid-tones. And I'm really just at this point playing around and trying to find my way forward. You may also notice that the direction of the brushstroke is these lines, which is a texture I think works very well for a non-metallic metal to show the kind of treatment that the material has got, which oftentimes is sort of a polished look where we can really pull all the lines in the same direction. It gives a nice sort of distortion that fits well with the non-metallic metal technique. So the reflections are distorted in the way that they're pulled in these tiny lines. And again, once we come in with brighter colors over these different hues that we've put down, they'll react to the underlying layers in different ways and create variation in the result. I also want to take this opportunity to give a special shout out to my patrons. I really appreciate the support I'm getting over on Patreon, and if you're interested in joining, the Patreon offers a ton of exciting perks such as private coaching and early access to lessons and extended edits of the videos as well. So if you're interested in that, be sure to check out the link in the description for the Patreon. Let's get back to the painting. So here I'm coming in with the darker orangish tone, and you can see that I've done a bit of color glazing to kind of change the temperature a bit of the lighting on one side here. But still the elements that are facing forward and facing in another orientation can catch the more neutral light. Just glazing in some transparent color here to shift things a little bit in selected areas. And again here the reflection of the environment becomes different, is like depicted differently on the cylinder shape that sits in the neck or like behind the head. The temperature contrast is starting to show with the blue on one side and the orange on another. But it's a subtle difference, and it should be a subtle difference. These two parts of the helmet should be set in the same world, so to speak. And here we can glaze in some shadow colors for the red armor and put the finishing touches on the red armor as well. We can come in with some darker colors and start to paint in some of the weathering details and shade some of these darker crevices. We can even freehand on some scratches ourselves as well. Another idea would also be to do some sponging with some darker color as to chip off some of the red paint that supposedly sits on this armor plate here. Here I'm just painting brighter tones underneath the sculpted lines, but also on some of the free-handed lines to create that kind of weathered effect. And the miniature is finished. You can see how I've glazed over some things and try to integrate the texture a little bit more, but this is the final view. And there we have the Mandalorian miniature finished. I actually painted two different versions of this. One was done for a workshop where I was demoing, and this other one was done that you saw in the video here. I want to talk briefly about the second version that I've done, where I've tried to push some of the more environmental lights, and it really is just a suggestion of some sort of different setting for the character. You can also see how the light placement differs and how the colored light of the orange really takes up much more real estate at the front view. Painting the same figures twice is not something that I do often, and doing this for the Mandalorian is something that really brought some unique and interesting learning opportunities, and this is what I wanted to share with you in this video here. Let me know which version you prefer down in the comments. If you like what you've seen and you're looking to support me or my work, you can go ahead and check out the Patreon that's in the description. There's also a Twitch channel and an Instagram account where you can follow my work as well. The Patreon offers longer, more exclusive lessons and really is geared towards the painter that is serious about taking their painting to the next level. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed what you've seen, and happy painting.